The brother and sister still drove the same SUV, but the experience of being in it had changed. Instead of anxiety when they saw police lights, they felt a sense of purpose. They'd learned that change was possible, that systems could be reformed, that 5 minutes of injustice could lead to years of progress if people were willing to do the work. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, their father looked at the framed newspaper article about that night hanging in their hallway. "You know what the real change was?" he asked. It wasn't the laws or the training or even the community programs. It was people realizing they had the power to make things better. The sister smiled, thinking of all the young people she'd spoken to over the past year. And realizing they don't have to wait for something bad to happen to start making changes, she added. Her debate trophy caught the evening light, casting a golden glow on the wall. The autumn breeze still rustled through the trees on their street, but it carried a different energy now. The neighborhood had become a symbol of what was possible when fear turned to action, when privilege was used to create change, when 5 minutes of darkness led to endless moments of light. Their story had become part of a larger narrative, not just about what went wrong, but about how to make things right. 1 year later, the quiet suburban street had become something of a landmark. Tour buses would sometimes slow down, guides pointing out where a 5-minute confrontation had sparked lasting change. But for the family who lived through it, the transformation went far deeper than any historical marker could show. The brother, now in his first year of college, had turned his experience into a mission. His dorm room walls were covered with news clippings and campaign posters from various police reform initiatives. He'd started a nationwide student organization called 5 Minutes Forward, connecting young people who wanted to turn their own difficult encounters with law enforcement into opportunities for change. "It's not about those 5 minutes anymore," he often said during campus speeches. "It's about all the minutes that follow and what we choose to do with them." His voice had grown stronger over the past year, no longer just the careful young man who knew how to survive a traffic stop, but a leader who was helping others find their voice. The sister had taken her debate skills to a new level, becoming a sought-after speaker at youth advocacy events. Her trophy from that night sat on a shelf in their father's Senate office, next to the framed body camera footage bill he'd managed to pass with bipartisan support. She'd learned to tell their story in a way that opened hearts and changed minds, especially when speaking to other young people. Their local police department had become a national model for reform. The mandatory bias training program, developed with input from community leaders and civil rights experts, was being adopted by departments across the country. Every new officer went through an intensive community engagement program, spending time with families, attending neighborhood events, and learning the history of the communities they served. The 2 officers from that night had taken different paths. One had left law enforcement entirely, later speaking out about the systemic issues he'd been part of. The other had committed herself to reform, becoming an instructor in the new training program, using her own mistakes to teach others. Their story became part of the training curriculum, a reminder that 5 minutes of poor judgment could impact countless lives. Mrs. Thompson's front lawn had become an unofficial community center. Every month, she hosted neighbor nights, where residents shared stories, discussed concerns, and built the kind of connections that made everyone feel safer. Her golden retriever had become something of a mascot for community policing, often wearing a vest that read, "Pause for Peace." The Chen family's twins had started a youth documentary project, capturing stories from their generation about interactions with law enforcement. Their work had won several awards and was being used in police academies nationwide. Mr. Rodriguez's rose garden now included a small memorial bench inscribed with the date of the incident and the words, "Change blooms here." Their father's Accountability in Law Enforcement Act had passed with unprecedented support, creating new standards for police conduct and civilian oversight. But more importantly, it had sparked a wave of local initiatives. Communities across the country had started their own versions of 5 Minutes Forward, adapting the program to address their specific needs and challenges. The family's driveway, where they had stood trembling that autumn night, had become a gathering place for community events. They'd hosted workshops on knowing your rights, sessions on peaceful advocacy, and meetings between police officers and local youth. The fear of that night had been transformed into a foundation for understanding. Their mother had established a legal clinic specifically focused on police accountability cases, She worked with a network of volunteer attorneys, ensuring that families without Senate connections could still find justice. Every parent should be able to protect their children, she would say, not just those with power. News outlets dubbed it the 5-minute revolution, how a single incident of swift accountability had sparked a national movement for systemic change. But in their kitchen that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, their father reminded them of something important. Real change doesn't happen in 5 minutes. It happens in all the minutes that follow, when people decide to keep pushing for what's right. The sun set on their suburban street, now forever changed by what had happened there. The news trucks were still present, but they had been joined by community organizers, policy experts, and ordinary citizens who wanted to be part of the solution. What had started as one family's frightening encounter had become a catalyst for the kind of change that couldn't be stopped, not by politics, not by resistance to reform, not by anything. By sunrise the next morning, video clips from neighbors' phones had spread across social media like wildfire. The suburban street where it all happened had become the center of a national conversation. News trucks lined the curb, their morning broadcasts cutting between footage of the incident and live shots of the now quiet neighborhood. Their father sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from fellow senators, civil rights leaders, and community organizers. He hadn't slept much, spending the night drafting what would become the Accountability and Law Enforcement Act. The brother and sister watched him work, still processing how their frightening experience was transforming into something bigger than themselves. "Your experience matters," their mother said, setting down cups of hot chocolate in front of them. "But what matters more is how we use it to help others." She had already filed 3 different legal motions before breakfast, her lawyer's instincts turning parental protection into professional action. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen TV. Clips from their father's impromptu street speech were being shared across every major network. "What happened to my children tonight?" his voice rang out, "is happening to families across America. The only difference is that I had the power to make it stop immediately." That power shouldn't depend on having a Senate pin. Outside, their neighbors had organized an impromptu community meeting on the front lawns. Mrs. Thompson had brought her famous cookies, the Chen family was sharing their experiences with law enforcement, and Mr. Rodriguez was showing people his video footage. What had started as a scary incident was becoming a moment of community unity and shared purpose. The sisters' debate team showed up in full force, carrying signs supporting police reform. They gathered in the driveway, their presence a reminder that young voices mattered in this conversation too. The brothers' classmates joined as well, many sharing their own stories of similar encounters that hadn't ended with such swift justice. Their father's office released the police body camera footage with the family's consent. The raw video told an undeniable story: 2 teenagers, following every rule they'd been taught, facing unnecessary aggression simply because of assumptions made about them. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with similar stories from across the country. Parents shared the rules they taught their children, the careful instructions about how to survive traffic stops, the extra burden of preparation that some families carried. The comment sections filled with painful personal accounts, each one underlining why change was necessary. The police chief held a press conference on their front lawn, announcing immediate policy changes that would affect every precinct in the city. "What happened here shows us where we've failed," he admitted, cameras flashing as he spoke. "But it also shows us how quickly we can implement solutions when there's political will to do so." Their father stood at his Senate podium later that day, his children's school IDs in his hand. "These should be nothing more than pieces of plastic," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "They shouldn't have to be shields against police misconduct. Every child deserves to drive home from school without fear, regardless of who their parents are." The legislation he proposed was comprehensive: mandatory bias training, stricter protocols for traffic stops, immediate review of body camera footage, and clear consequences for violations. But more importantly, it included funding for community oversight boards, ensuring that accountability wouldn't depend on having powerful connections. Back in their neighborhood, the community had organized a workshop on knowing your rights. The local civil rights organization set up tables with information, and volunteer lawyers offered free consultations. Their mother moved through the crowd, answering questions, turning anger into action, fear into determination. The sister found herself sharing her story with other debate teams across the city, her trophy now a symbol of both personal achievement and unexpected advocacy. The brother started a student organization focused on police reform, turning his experience into a platform for change. As the crowd began to disperse and the official vehicles pulled away one by one, their father stood with them in their driveway, his arm around their mother, watching his children process what had happened. The street was returning to its quiet suburban normalcy, but something had fundamentally changed. In just 5 minutes, they had witnessed both the worst and the best of the system, its capacity for abuse and its potential for correction when proper pressure was applied. The brother picked up his sister's debate trophy from where Mr. Rodriguez had carefully placed it on the hood of their SUV. The golden figure seemed to gleam differently now, as if it too had witnessed something important. Their father looked at it thoughtfully before speaking. "Tomorrow, we turn this into action. Tonight, we're just family." The four of them headed inside, leaving the news vans and the lingering neighbors to tell the story of how 5 minutes had changed everything. The next few minutes unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. Their father stood in the street, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the measured tones that had shaped legislation. "Yes, Chief, I want every second of body camera footage preserved," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in public service. "And I want it reviewed right now." 3 more unmarked police vehicles arrived within minutes, their lights off but their presence unmistakable. The police chief himself stepped out of the first car, already wearing his dress uniform as if he'd been prepared for an emergency. His face was a mask of professional concern as he approached their father, but his eyes kept darting to the growing crowd of neighbors still recording everything on their phones. "Let's review the footage right now," the police chief announced, gesturing to a mobile command unit that had just pulled up. The 2 officers who had conducted the stop stood awkwardly by their cruiser, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous glances at their superiors. The brother and sister watched as their father followed the chief to the command unit, his back straight, his purpose clear. Inside the mobile unit, multiple screens flickered to life, showing different angles of the stop from the officers' body cameras. The footage was damning in its clarity, the aggressive approach, the unnecessary escalation, the complete lack of probable cause. The sister could see her father's jaw tightening as he watched, his years as a civil rights attorney before entering politics giving him a precise understanding of each violation. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed into an impromptu community gathering. Mrs. Thompson had brought out bottles of water for everyone. The Chen family was helping organize the scattered school supplies, carefully tucking papers back into folders. Mr. Rodriguez had positioned himself near the officer's cruiser, his phone still recording, a silent guardian ensuring nothing else would happen. The brother stood with his sister near their SUV, both watching the proceedings with a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. Their father had taught them about systems and how they worked, but seeing it in action was different. A senior officer approached them, her manner gentle but professional, taking their statements with careful attention to detail. "Administrative leave, effective immediately," the police chief's voice carried from the command unit. The 2 officers were now being escorted to a separate vehicle, their badges and weapons already surrendered. The speed of accountability felt almost surreal. What had been a terrifying abuse of power just minutes ago was now being dismantled with bureaucratic efficiency. Their mother arrived at this moment, rushing from her law office across town. She wrapped her children in a fierce hug before stepping back to examine them with tears in her eyes. "You did everything right," she whispered, pride mixing with pain in her voice. "Everything we taught you." She then turned to join their father, her own legal expertise adding another layer of scrutiny to the situation. The news vans had multiplied, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like modern totems. Reporters stood at a respectful distance, but their cameras captured everything. The police chief's grim expression, the departing officers, the united community. This wasn't just a story about one incident anymore. It was becoming a symbol of something larger. Internal affairs investigators arrived next, their presence marking the official beginning of a formal investigation. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering statements, preserving evidence, ensuring nothing would be overlooked. The brother watched them photograph his sister's scattered debate materials, now potential evidence in a civil rights investigation. Their father emerged from the command unit, his face showing the complex emotions of a parent who was also a public servant. He gathered his family close, speaking softly so only they could hear. "This ends tonight, but it also begins tonight. What happened to you happens to families across this country every day. The only difference is they don't have a Senate pin to make it stop." The police chief was already implementing immediate policy changes. All traffic stops would now require clear probable cause to be radioed in before initiation. Body cameras would be reviewed daily, not monthly. Additional bias training would begin next week. The machinery of reform was grinding into motion, powered by privilege and position that shouldn't have been necessary to ensure basic rights. The sound of tires gripping asphalt cut through the tense evening air. A black government vehicle turned sharply onto the street, its headlights illuminating the scene like a spotlight. The car came to a precise stop about 20 feet from the police cruiser, its engine purring with quiet authority. Their father emerged from the car with the measured calm of someone who had spent decades in the halls of power. He was still wearing his suit from the Senate committee meeting, his official pin gleaming on his lapel. The sister felt tears of relief threatening to fall, but she held them back, maintaining her composure just as they'd been taught. "Those are my children," their father's voice carried clearly through the night air, firm but controlled. He walked forward with deliberate steps, his hands visible at his sides, decades of experience guiding his every movement. "I'm a United States Senator, and this is my family's vehicle." The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. Their hands moved away from their weapons, and their postures straightened as recognition dawned in their eyes. The one who had been searching the car stepped back, nearly tripping over the scattered school supplies he'd thrown on the ground. "Sir, we were just conducting a routine," the first officer began, but their father raised his hand slightly, the gesture carrying the weight of countless legislative sessions. "My children were driving home from school in our family vehicle," he stated, his voice carrying the same tone he used during Senate hearings. "I'd like to know the probable cause for this stop." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. By now, the crowd of neighbors had grown. Phone cameras glinted in the darkness like fireflies, recording every moment. The brother could see Mrs. Thompson nodding approvingly, her golden retriever sitting alert beside her. The Chen family had moved closer, their twins still perched on their bikes, watching history unfold on their quiet suburban street. Their father reached slowly into his jacket, producing his Senate ID and driver's license. "I'm going to call the police chief now," he informed the officers, his tone making it clear this wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact. "But first, I want my children to step away from the vehicle and stand with me." The officers, who minutes ago had been so aggressive, now stepped back without protest. The brother and sister moved carefully to their father's side, their legs slightly shaky after standing so long in one position. Their father placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders, a gesture that was both protective and grounding. "Are you both okay?" he asked softly, his public persona slipping for just a moment to reveal their concerned father. They nodded, and he squeezed their shoulders gently before returning his attention to the officers. The sister noticed more cars arriving, unmarked vehicles with government plates. Senior police officials were already responding to their father's calls. She watched as her debate trophy was carefully picked up from the ground by Mr. Rodriguez, who had finally left his post at the fence to help gather their scattered belongings. The neighborhood had become an impromptu town hall, with residents standing witness to the power of position and privilege confronting unchecked authority. Their father's presence had transformed the scene from a moment of powerlessness to one of accountability, but there was sadness in his eyes, the knowledge that not every family had a Senate pin to protect them. The brother started helping collect his sister's debate materials, noticing how his hands had stopped shaking. The officers stood awkwardly by their cruiser, speaking in hushed tones into their radios. Their earlier confidence had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of scrutiny. More lights appeared at the end of the street, news vans were already arriving. Their father had taught them about moments like these, about how quickly a private injustice could become a public lesson. He turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the weight of both personal anguish and public responsibility. Tonight, he began in the same tone he used for his most important Senate speeches. We're going to have an honest conversation about what happened here. He looked at his children with pride, not just for how they had handled themselves, but for how their experience would now serve a greater purpose. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last traces of the peaceful evening this had started as. But something new was taking shape in its place, a moment of reckoning, a chance for change. All because a father had arrived in time to transform his children's ordeal into an opportunity for justice. The next 5 minutes would show everyone present exactly what accountability looked like when power met responsibility. A new set of headlights turned onto their street, moving faster than the usual neighborhood traffic. The sister felt her heart leap. She recognized the sound of their father's car, the specific way it hummed when he was in a hurry. Help was finally approaching, but these next few moments would be the most crucial of all. They just had to stay calm for a little longer, stay focused for a few more minutes. The brother and sister exchanged a quick glance, a lifetime of sibling communication condensed into one look. They both knew what was coming. They both knew that everything was about to change. But for now, they held their positions, their parents' lessons echoing in their minds. Stay strong, stay smart, stay safe. The consequences were about to arrive, and they had done everything right to make it to this moment. The brother and sister stood motionless against their SUV, their minds racing but their bodies perfectly still. Years of family discussions around the dinner table, careful instructions from their parents, and stories from family friends had prepared them for this moment. Now, those lessons were no longer hypothetical, they were desperately real. The sister's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, likely their mother responding to the emergency alert she'd managed to send. The soft vibration felt like a lifeline, a reminder that help was coming. She wanted so badly to check it, to reach out to their parents again, but she kept her hands visible just as they'd practiced at home. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," one officer demanded, shining his flashlight directly into the brother's eyes. The beam was unnecessarily bright, but the brother didn't flinch. Instead, he remembered his father's words from years ago, "Your dignity is armor they can't take away." He stood straight, looking at a point just past the officer's shoulder, his voice steady as he repeated, "Sir, I can show you our registration and insurance. They're in the glove compartment." Their textbooks lay scattered on the ground, homework assignments fluttering in the evening breeze. The sister watched as her notebook fell open, revealing the speech she'd given earlier at the debate competition. Just hours ago, she'd been celebrating her victory. Now, she was trying to remember everything her parents had taught them about staying safe in situations like this. More neighbors had gathered on their porches and lawns, maintaining a careful distance but bearing witness. The Chen twins' mother had joined them at the corner, her phone held up discreetly. Old Mr. Rodriguez hadn't moved from his fence, his own phone still recording steadily. The sister felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. Embarrassment at being treated like criminals in front of their neighbors, but grateful that so many eyes were watching, so many cameras were recording. The second officer was still rifling through their belongings, his movements becoming more frustrated as he found nothing suspicious. "Where did you get the laptops?" he demanded, holding up their school-issued computers. The sister wanted to explain about their college prep program, about how every student in their grade had the same model, but she remembered her mother's advice. Sometimes silence is the safest response. A car alarm went off in the distance, making everyone jump slightly. The brother used the moment to take a slow, deep breath, just like they'd practiced during their family's safety discussions. Their father had always emphasized staying calm under pressure. Your mind is your strongest tool. Keep it clear, keep it focused. The sister noticed her hands were shaking slightly, so she pressed them firmly against the hood of the car. The metal felt cool under her palms, grounding her in reality. She could see her reflection in the polished surface. Her debate team blazer was wrinkled now, her carefully chosen outfit for the competition looking disheveled after the rough search. Through the growing crowd of onlookers, Mrs. Thompson had edged closer, her golden retriever sitting alertly by her side. The sister could hear her talking quietly on her phone, likely calling the local community watch group. More lights were coming on in the houses down the street, more faces appearing in windows. Their neighborhood was becoming an audience to this unwanted performance. The brother started counting silently in his head, another technique their parents had taught them. count to 10, then start over. Focus on the numbers, not the fear. Not the way the officer's hand kept returning to his weapon. Not the way their school supplies were being treated like evidence of a crime. Just count. 1, 2, 3. Behind them, they could hear the officers discussing something in low voices. The sister caught fragments of their conversation, something about the address on their IDs matching the upscale neighborhood, about the school's name on their laptops being from the prestigious prep academy nearby. She could sense their certainty beginning to waver, but their aggressive stance hadn't changed. The brother's legs were starting to ache from standing so still, but he didn't dare move to stretch them. Instead, he thought about the family photo in his wallet, the one taken at their father's Senate swearing-in ceremony. He wished the officers would let him show it to them, but he knew reaching for his wallet now would be too risky. So he kept counting, kept breathing, kept hoping their parents would arrive soon. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed in the rearview mirror, casting strange shadows inside the SUV. The brother's heart skipped a beat, but his hands remained steady on the wheel at 10 and 2. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. No speeding, no rolling stops, not even a burnt-out taillight. Still, he took a deep breath and remembered everything his parents had taught him. Stay calm, he told his sister, his voice steady despite the anxiety building in his chest. Remember what Mom and Dad said? She nodded, already reaching for her phone while keeping it low in her lap. Their parents had prepared them for this possibility, though they'd hoped it would never happen. The brother carefully activated the turn signal and pulled over to the curb, making sure to choose a well-lit spot under a street lamp. He turned off the engine but left the keys visible on the dashboard. The interior lights were on, showing they had nothing to hide. Through the mirror, he could see 2 officers approaching, one on each side of the vehicle. Keep your hands where they can see them, he reminded his sister, though she already had them resting in her lap, palms up. The debate trophy gleamed innocently in the backseat, catching the harsh glare of the police spotlights. The tap on the window was unnecessarily loud, making them both jump slightly. The brother lowered the window slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Good evening, officer," he said clearly, but before he could continue, the flashlight beam hit his face directly. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his hand already resting on his weapon. "Both of you out now." The brother's voice remained steady as he replied, "Sir, this is our family's car. I can show you my license and registration." I said out of the vehicle. The second officer was already moving to the passenger side, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior. The sister's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them visible, just as they'd been taught. They complied carefully, stepping out into the cool evening air. The peaceful neighborhood suddenly felt different, hostile. A few neighbors' porch lights flicked on, curious faces appearing in windows. The brother could see Mrs. Thompson frozen on her front lawn, her golden retriever sitting obediently at her feet as she watched the scene unfold. "Hands on the hood," the first officer commanded, while his partner began circling the SUV. "Where did you get this vehicle?" The question hung in the air, its implications clear and painful. The brother started to explain again about their father, about how this was their family car, but the officers weren't listening. The sister stood perfectly still as the second officer began roughly searching their backpacks, dumping homework assignments and textbooks onto the ground. Her debate trophy toppled out, landing with a dull thud on the asphalt. She wanted to reach for it, but knew better than to move. Behind them, more lights were turning on in neighboring houses. The Chen twins had stopped their bikes at the corner, watching with wide eyes. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his garden fence, phone in hand, quietly recording everything. The neighborhood that had felt so safe just minutes ago now felt like a stage, with them in an unwanted spotlight. The first officer was reading their school IDs now, his flashlight beam making the laminated cards gleam. "A lot of high-end stuff in here for a couple of kids," his partner commented, holding up their phones and laptops. The brother bit back the urge to explain that their father was a senator. He knew that sudden movements or raised voices could make things worse. Their father had taught them that moments like these were like walking on thin ice. Every movement, every word had to be carefully chosen. So they stood there, the autumn breeze now feeling cold against their skin, as the officers continued their unwarranted search. The sister's finger hovered over the emergency alert she'd managed to send, praying their parents would arrive soon. The sound of more sirens in the distance made the officers pause briefly, but they continued their search with an increasing sense of urgency. What they didn't know was that those sirens marked the beginning of consequences they never expected. Consequences that would arrive in exactly 5 minutes. The autumn sun was setting over Washington, D.C., painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as two teenagers drove home from their after-school activities. The older brother, a high school senior with a fresh driver's license, gripped the steering wheel of their family's black SUV with the careful attention of a new driver. His younger sister sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone while occasionally glancing up to point out something interesting along their familiar route home. "Mom's going to be so excited about my debate team news," the sister said, tucking her phone into her backpack. She had just won her first major debate competition, and the trophy sitting in the backseat was proof of her hard work. Her brother nodded, keeping his eyes on the road while smoothly navigating a turn. "And Dad's probably going to want to hang it right next to his awards in the study," he replied with a grin. The siblings had grown up in this peaceful suburban neighborhood where tree-lined streets led to beautiful homes with well-maintained lawns. Their father's position as a U.S. Senator meant they lived in one of the nicer areas, but they had always been taught to stay humble and grateful. The brother was especially conscious of this as he drove their luxury SUV, making sure to follow every traffic rule to the letter. Their conversation drifted from school gossip to their plans for the upcoming weekend. The sister was organizing a community service project for her student council, while her brother was preparing for his upcoming college interviews. Despite their busy schedules, they always found time to support each other's activities. As they passed the local park where they used to play as kids, the sister noticed the new playground equipment being installed. "Remember when you pushed me too high on the old swings and I jumped off?" she laughed, adjusting the air conditioning vent. Her brother rolled his eyes. "And you didn't tell Mom and Dad because you didn't want me to get in trouble. That was the day I knew you were cool." The familiar sights of their neighborhood rolled by: Mrs. Thompson walking her golden retriever, the Chen family's twins riding their bikes, and old Mr. Rodriguez tending to his prized rose garden. It was the kind of evening that felt completely normal, completely safe. The kind of evening where nothing could go wrong. The brother checked his mirrors and speed regularly, just as he'd been taught in driver's ed. Their parents had given him extra lessons too, teaching him things that weren't in any driving manual but were essential for a young black man behind the wheel. Keep your license and registration easily accessible. Both hands visible on the wheel. No sudden movements. Rules that shouldn't have to exist but did. The sister was now humming along to a pop song playing softly on the radio, her debate trophy catching the last rays of sunlight through the rear window. They were only 10 minutes from home, and she was already thinking about the celebration dinner their mom had promised. Their father had texted earlier saying he might make it home early from his Senate committee meeting too. The speed limit changed from 35 to 25, and the brother eased off the gas, watching the speedometer drop accordingly. A police cruiser passed them going the opposite direction, and he instinctively checked his speed again. Everything was fine. They were doing everything right, just like always. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining their street, and the neighborhood kids were being called in for dinner. It was just another peaceful evening drive home, the kind they'd made hundreds of times before. Neither of them could have known that in just a few minutes, their routine afternoon would become anything but ordinary.